Welcome to the art class.
When you picture the absolute pinnacle of European fine art, your mind probably goes straight to French Impressionism, right?
Oh, definitely. It's usually the first thing people think of.
Yeah, you think of like Claude Monet's serene water lilies, or I don't know, Vincent van Gogh's swirling emotional skies.
Yeah,
And we are basically taught that these guys were the ultimate solitary visionaries.
right. These isolated geniuses.
Exactly. Just inventing a completely new way of seeing the world right there in the cafes and the countryside of 19th century France. But what if you found out that this most celebrated, quintessential European art movement actually owes its entire visual playbook to, well, a 12-year-old Japanese firefighter and a 500-kilometer walk?
Yeah, it sounds absurd when you frame it that way.
It really does.
But tracing the lineage of those famous French paintings leads us directly to that 12-year-old. And looking closely at his story challenges everything we are taught about where artistic genius actually comes from. You know, how it travels.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to trace how mass-produced, basically disposable Japanese prints completely rewrote Western art history. And to understand how this firefighter eventually rewired the brains of the greatest painters in Europe, we have to look at Edo.
Right, which we now call Tokyo.
Yes, Tokyo. But back in the year 1809, so who was this kid?
So his name was Utagawa Hiroshige. And in 1809, Japan is under the control of the Tokugawa shogunate.
Which is a military dictatorship, right?
Yeah, exactly. A military dictatorship that has kept the country largely isolated from the rest of the world for, like, a couple of centuries at this point.
Wow, okay.
And Hiroshige is born into a family living right next to Edo Castle, which is the seat of the ruling shogun. His father held a really respectable government post. He was a castle fire warden.
Okay, so a pretty solid middle class or government class upbringing.
Exactly. But when Hiroshige is just 12 years old, both of his parents die within weeks of each other.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah. And because of the strict hereditary nature of these societal roles in Japan at the time, this 12-year-old orphan immediately inherits his father's post.
Wait. I am trying to wrap my head around a literal child being tasked with protecting the most important military compound in Japan from burning down. Like a 12-year-old.
I know it sounds crazy today, but by title, he was the fire warden. In practice, though, he had subordinates who handled the actual, logistics and danger of the firefighting.
Okay, so he's delegating.
Yeah, he's the boss on paper.
Okay.
And this arrangement actually worked out really well for him because his real obsession was drawing.
He didn't want to fight fires.
Not at all. So shortly after he inherits this warden position, he's actually accepted to study under a master of the Utagawa School of woodblock printing.
Right.
And for the next 2 decades, he essentially lives this dual life. He is a government fire warden by duty, but a printmaker by obsession.
So let's talk about what he was actually making during those first 2 decades. Because I'm assuming, since we are doing a deep dive on him today, he was just churning out revolutionary masterpieces right from the start.
Well, no, actually, he was producing very standard commercial subjects of the era.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he drew portraits of popular kabuki actors, famous warriors, courtesans.
The pop culture of the day.
Exactly. It was highly competent work, but it wasn't, shifting the artistic landscape. The inciting incident for that shift doesn't actually happen until 1832.
Okay, so he's what, 35 at this point?
He's 35, and he gets an official assignment to join a shogunate delegation traveling from Edo to Kyoto.
Now, if the shogun is sending a delegation, I imagine this is some major geopolitical mission, like a war council or some massive trade negotiation.
No, the mission was to escort 2 white horses.
Horses?
Yes, 2 white horses. They were a ceremonial tribute being presented to the emperor.
You're kidding. A
Well,
whole delegation for 2 horses.
Yep. And the journey required walking 500 kilometers along the Tōkaidō, which is the Eastern Sea Road. And this was Japan's primary, most heavily trafficked artery.
Right, and if you are listening to this and picturing like a quiet, scenic dirt path winding through the misty mountains, erase that image. Because the Tōkaidō was less of a country road and more of a 500-kilometer rolling city.
Exactly.
It was packed with samurai, wealthy merchants, VIP motorcades basically, and just thousands of commuters all jamming this one route. And Hiroshi is walking this bustling, massive highway, tasked with watching 2 horses.
And out of all the visual chaos in that rolling city, he makes a very specific choice. There were 53 official post stations along this route.
Like places to rest, change horses, pay tolls.
Right. And at every single one of them, he pulls out a sketchbook. But, and here's the key, he isn't drawing the grand processions of samurai or the wealthy elites.
The people you'd think would be the main subject.
Exactly. He looks past the human hierarchy entirely. He looks at the weather.
The weather.
He draws the fog rolling in over a hill. He sketches a sudden violent downpour or, the specific way the light hits a bamboo grove at dusk.
Which feels totally intuitive to us now because we are so used to landscape photography and nature documentaries. We see mountains and skies all the time.
Yeah.
But making the weather the primary subject wasn't standard practice at the time, was it?
It was incredibly rare. What he was doing had almost no precedent in Western art, and it didn't even have a formal category in Japanese art.
Really?
Yeah, traditionally, landscape or weather was just the background. It was like a theatrical stage set designed to frame a human narrative, a famous battle, or a mythological story.
Just wallpaper for the main event.
Right. But Hiroshi's flips that dynamic completely. He decides that the rain itself is the story. The humans in his sketches, they're just nameless shapes reacting to the atmosphere.
So he finishes this 500-kilometer commute, fills up his sketchbooks with all his atmospheric weather, and he heads back to Edo. But translating those ink sketches into mass-produced art requires a very specific technology, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And this brings us into the mechanics of woodblock printing, which is crucial to understanding why this art looks so different from anything happening in Europe.
Right. So the process is called ukiyo-e, and it is a massive collaborative effort. It's not just one guy painting. Hiroshi would draw the final design in ink on this incredibly thin paper.
Okay.
And then he'd hand that to a master woodcarver who would glue the paper face down onto a block of cherry wood.
Wait, face down?
Yes. Because then the carver takes a chisel and cuts away all the empty space, leaving only the lines of the drawing raised up.
Oh, wow. Which means the original drawing is literally destroyed in the process of making the printing block.
Yes, the original is completely lost.
That's wild.
It is. So then, a printer takes that carved block, coats the raised lines in ink, and presses a sheet of paper onto it to create the black outline.
Okay, so that's just the black lines. What about the colors?
And here is where the color comes in, which dictates the entire visual style. For every single color you want in the final image.
Wait, every single color?
Every single one. Blue for the sky, green for the trees, red for a kimono. The carver has to cut a completely separate, perfectly aligned block of wood.
If you think about the physical reality of carving solid cherry wood, it explains so much about the aesthetic. Like, you cannot easily carve soft, blended, smoky gradients into wood.
Exactly. The medium forces you to use bold, flat shapes of solid color. The medium literally dictates the grammar.
I love that.
So over the next year, Hiroshige and his publisher translate his sketches from the road into a series of 55 woodblock prints, one for each of the 53 stations plus the start and end points.
Okay. And these blocks can be stamped over and over again, right?
Thousands of times. And because of that, the economics of this operation were entirely geared toward the working class. When this series was published between 1833 and 1834, a single print was priced at roughly 12 to 16 copper coins.
Wait, to put that in perspective for anyone listening,
Yeah.
12 copper coins in 1830s Edo was the exact cost of a bowl of noodle soup. Or, like, a cheap pair of straw sandals. So this wasn't fine art commissioned by a wealthy patron to hang in a palace.
Not at all.
This was commercial media. It was the 19th century equivalent of grabbing a magazine or a comic book at the checkout line.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that a carpenter or a seamstress or a fishmonger could just pick one up on their walk home from work. And they did. They bought them by the tens of thousands.
Wow.
This series was an unprecedented hit. Almost overnight, Hiroshige becomes the most celebrated printmaker of his era. And it's primarily because everyday people recognize their own lived reality in his scenes of rain and snow. It wasn't about untouchable elites anymore.
But the cultural gatekeepers of Japan, they did not view this as high art, did they?
Oh, no, not at all. In the strict hierarchy of Japanese culture at the time, traditional ink painting and calligraphy...
Stuff the elites did.
Right, which required years of elite philosophical study that was considered fine art. Woodblock prints were classified as craft. They were seen as disposable popular culture. The artistic establishment looked down on ukiyo-e the exact same way a prestigious literary critic today might, dismiss a mass-market comic book.
It's crazy because the guy is churning out absolute masterclasses in visual economy for the price of soup, and the elites are just dismissing it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the print from his series depicting the Shuno station, it is staggering.
It's incredible.
It shows a hillside bamboo grove and a sudden violent rainstorm breaks out. And the block carvers managed to create these aggressive diagonal lines of rain cutting across the entire image.
Right.
The colors are just these flat, pale grays and greens. The people in the scene are bent over, scrambling up the hill, totally faceless and just subjected to the power of the weather. It looks incredibly modern. It relies on geometry and extreme cropping rather than the illusion of deep three-dimensional space.
Totally. To a modern eye, it actually anticipates 20th century abstraction. But to the Japanese establishment of the 1830s, it was just a cheap poster.
Just a cheap poster. Okay, so Hiroshi's is selling tens of thousands of these brilliant prints in Edo. But a localized commercial print run doesn't explain how these images leap across the globe to the fancy art salons of Paris, especially since Japan was notoriously closed off to the world at this time.
Right. That bridge is built by a mix of geopolitics and historical accident. So Hiroshi died in 1858. He was 61 years old. He had never seen Europe, and Europe had never heard his name.
Okay.
But just a few years prior to his death, in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry had sailed his fleet into Japanese waters.
Using the threat of military force to basically compel Japan to open its ports to international trade.
Exactly, ending centuries of isolationism. So by the late 1850s and into the 1860s, there was this massive export boom.
Right.
Japanese goods like lacquerware, screens, and specifically ceramics are suddenly flooding onto ships bound for European markets.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you are packing a wooden crate full of delicate porcelain teacups to survive a sea voyage halfway around the world,
You need packing material.
you need bubble wrap.
Yes. And since the Japanese establishment viewed ukiyo-e prints as mass-produced, disposable crafts, the shippers utilized them in the most mundane way possible.
Unbelievable.
They took hundreds of thousands of unsold or overstock woodblock prints, including Hiroshige's, crumpled them up, and stuffed them into the crates to protect the ceramics.
Just imagine being a Parisian artist in the 1860s. You open up a shipment of imported ceramics in some warehouse, you smooth out the crumpled up bubble wrap inside to see what is printed on it, and that bubble wrap fundamentally changes the way you view reality.
The French artists who saw this packing paper were stunned. By the 1870s, an art dealer in Paris named Siegfried Bing recognized the aesthetic value of this paper and actually started selling these prints formally. And the rising stars of the French art scene, people like Edgar Degas, Claude Monet, and James McNeill Whistler, they descended on his shop. And they weren't just buying them as exotic curiosities to hang on the wall, they were studying them like textbooks.
And to understand why this was so shocking to a trained European painter, we have to look at the strict rules that had governed Western art since the Renaissance.
Right.
European painting was built on single-point perspective, designing an image so lines converge in the distance to create a perfect illusion of 3D space.
It also relied heavily on chiaroscuro, which is the intense modeling of light and shadow. You know, an artist would mix heavy browns and blacks to create deep shadows so a subject looked round and solid.
And the main subjects were almost always centered and balanced perfectly within the frame. The whole goal was to recreate a literal window into reality.
Exactly. And suddenly, here comes this crumbled paper from Edo, showing them an entirely different visual grammar. Hiroshi's prints taught these formally trained French artists that shadows were optional.
Just totally optional.
You could just use a flat, unshaded plane of red or blue to convey an entire mood. The prints showed them that classical perspective wasn't necessary either. You could push your main subject entirely to the edge of the frame, or even slice a figure in half at the border of the image, and the viewer's brain would still understand it.
The rules of Western art were suddenly revealed to be just one way of seeing the world rather than the objective truth of painting.
Yes. And the French masters actively reverse-engineered Hiroshige's work. I mean, Vincent van Gogh collected over 500 Japanese prints.
Over 500.
Yeah. We tend to mythologize Van Gogh as this tortured, spontaneous genius who just painted from pure emotion. But he literally took one of Hiroshige's prints, the sudden shower over Ohashi Bridge, and copied it stroke for stroke in oil paint.
Wow. He treated it like academic homework.
He really did. He even wrote a letter to his brother Theo stating, "All of my work is founded on Japanese art." And he referred to the Impressionists as the Japanese of France.
Okay, Van Gogh is one thing, but then there is Claude Monet. He collected 231 of these prints. And Monet is globally famous today for his water lily paintings, which are celebrated as like the ultimate expression of French nature.
Yes.
But he didn't just stumble upon a nice pond in the French countryside and paint it.
Not at all.
He literally constructed a real-life 3D model of Hiroshige's aesthetic in his backyard so he could copy the homework.
He really did. He bought property in Giverny in Normandy, and he spent years terraforming it. He had a pond dug specifically to emulate the environments he saw in Japanese prints. He imported exotic water lilies. He built the iconic curved Japanese footbridge.
That famous bridge.
Yes, he essentially created a physical walk-through manifestation of a Japanese woodblock print so that he could spend the last 30 years of his life painting it from observation.
That is mind-blowing.
So when you look at his famous massive water lily panels at the Orangerie Museum in Paris today, the ones that feature flat planes of color, no horizon line, and pure atmospheric reflection, that is, Hiroshige's grammar, translated into oil paint.
And it extended far beyond Van Gogh and Monet, too. Paul Cézanne adopted the flat-color planes to break down landscapes. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec used extreme, almost jarring cropping for his famous Moulin Rouge posters.
Which makes perfect sense because he was also making commercial media, just like Hiroshi.
Exactly. Even Gustav Klimt in Austria adopted that decorative flatness. There's actually a historian named Siegfried Wichmann who wrote a 500-page book exhaustively documenting the undeniable, direct visual parallels between these Japanese prints and Western masterpieces. The influence was so pervasive that the French even coined a word for it in 1872, Japonisme.
And we connect this to the bigger picture. This story forces us to completely redefine what originality means in art, or really in any discipline. Originality is rarely a spontaneous, immaculate invention born out of a vacuum. It is almost always the brilliant translation, synthesis, and transformation of an idea developed elsewhere. The Impressionists were undeniably brilliant painters, but their brilliance lay in recognizing the structural genius of Hiroshige's grammar and adapting it to their own mediums.
Which makes the curation of art history incredibly frustrating. The visual footprint is undeniable. The artists themselves, like Van Gogh, openly documented their reliance on the prints.
So what does this all mean? How do we justify celebrating the copyists while the guy who invented the grammar, Hiroshi, gets practically erased from standard Western art history textbooks?
It's a great question.
Because if you take a standard art history 101 class today, he might be a tiny footnote at the back of the syllabus if he is mentioned at all.
It raises vital questions about who gets to write the historical narrative and how art movements are marketed. Think about how Impressionism is sold to the public today. It is branded as a uniquely French triumph. The story curated by museums focuses on French light, Parisian boulevards, and a localized European rebellion against rigid European academies. And Hiroshi disrupts that entire marketing brand.
He is incredibly inconvenient to that narrative. First, because of his working-class status in Japan, he was classified as a craftsman of cheap pop culture, not an elite philosopher painter.
Right.
And second, because of how his work arrived in Europe as literal trash, crumpled up to protect teacups. For Eurocentric historians of the late 19th and 20th centuries, it was culturally unpalatable to position a working-class Japanese printmaker as a founding father of their most revered intellectual high art movement.
Because admitting that reliance completely shatters the myth of European supremacy and solitary genius in fine art.
Exactly. It is the story Western institutions chose to tell about themselves. And it highlights a crucial lesson for anyone consuming history today. We have to critically question the narratives handed down to us. Museums and textbooks are not objective mirrors reflecting pure truth. They are highly curated storytellers protecting specific legacies.
Looking back at this staggering chain of events, it's just, you have a guy in Edo in 1832 taking a 500-kilometer walk among a rolling city of samurai and merchants. He chooses to draw the rain and the fog. He turns those drawings into cheap, mass-produced prints, priced like a bowl of soup, designed for carpenters and fishmongers.
Yep.
Decades later, those prints are crumpled up as bubble wrap to protect teacups on a cargo ship to Paris. And that literal trash gets uncrumpled by the greatest painters of Europe, fundamentally dismantling the rules of Western art and eventually resulting in the priceless water lilies hanging in the Orangerie today.
It completely democratizes our understanding of where greatness can emerge. It rarely comes from the places we are told to expect it.
And for you listening, here is the secret key. The next time you are standing in a museum or even just looking at a print of an Impressionist painting online, you now know the underlying architecture. When you see that flat, beautiful plane of color, or the weather taking center stage with an asymmetrical composition, you aren't just looking at the French countryside, you are looking at Edo. You are looking through the eyes of a 12-year-old firefighter who just wanted to draw the rain.
I love that. And to push this idea into our own time, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Okay.
If the foundational visual grammar of the world's most revered 19th century art movement arrived in Europe as cheap, mass-produced, disposable pop culture, what currently disposable or wildly cheap media in our own modern culture right now might actually be the foundational blueprint for the high art of the 22nd century.
Oh, wow.
Could the chaotic aesthetic of a 10-second viral video or a seemingly throwaway internet meme today be the exact visual grammar that hangs in the finest museums 100 years from now?
That completely upends how I am going to look at my phone today. Just imagine the digital bubble wrap of today becoming the masterpiece of tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking closely, keep questioning the stories you are told, and we will catch you next time.